In a forgotten valley beyond the Blue Mountains, a single phone call uncovered a family the world was never meant to see, generations hidden, children born to silence, a bloodline folded inward until memory itself went blind. What began as an investigation became something else entirely, a question whispered through the rusted tin and empty shacks: how close can humanity come to vanishing before anyone notices it's gone? The first sound was the low chop of rotors echoing off the hills. A gray morning, cold enough that the mist held its breath, and the valley below seemed untouched by time. When the police helicopter banked over the ridge, the officers inside thought they were looking at the remains of a campsite: rusted sheets of tin, sagging tarps, a handful of fires long dead. But as the camera feed steadied, the image sharpened into something else: a cluster of makeshift shacks, stitched from wire, scrap metal, and wood stripped from abandoned barns. No roads led in. No smoke rose. Just silence and the shape of a settlement that wasn't supposed to exist. The call that brought them here had been vague. A welfare report filed by a school principal from a nearby town, describing rumors of children living off-grid somewhere in the hills of New South Wales. It had been dismissed before, marked as unverified, until one teacher mentioned a boy whose accent made no sense: flat vowels, words misplaced, grammar that sounded half-remembered. He said he lived in the valley, he didn't know which one. He just pointed south. That was enough to send a team. When the officers reached the dirt track, their boots sank in mud up to the ankle. The air smelled of damp earth and decay. No fences, no livestock, no vehicles, only the sound of their own breathing. Then movement. From the doorway of a tin shack, a child appeared. Barefoot. Thin. Hair matted with ash. She said nothing, only watched them, her face blank but her eyes alert, like someone seeing ghosts. More children emerged behind her, stepping carefully into the open. Their clothes were torn, their feet black with dirt. One of them carried a baby that couldn't have been more than a year old. Inside the shacks, the officers found mattresses made from straw and rags, pots of water clouded with algae, and crude drawings scrawled on the walls: circles, names, and symbols of family that repeated like echoes. There was no power, no plumbing, no sign of schooling. The youngest children couldn't tell their ages. Some didn't know what a city was. Others couldn't name the country they lived in. When asked about their parents, they spoke of uncle, of auntie, but every adult seemed to wear both titles. The lines of relation twisted inward until no outsider could trace them. One officer's report would later note the smell, the human weight of years without sanitation, and the silence that followed each question. The children stared, unblinking, as if language itself was foreign. A social worker whispered, "They don't know they're different." By nightfall, the valley filled with searchlights, each beam carving through the mist to reveal another shack, another face, another secret. And in that moment, the illusion of modern Australia cracked open. A hidden world had been living beneath it all along, forgotten by law, untouched by time, and now finally seen. When the investigators began to untangle the lineage of the Colt clan, they found that the name itself was an illusion, a single word draped over generations of secrecy. Colt appeared on birth certificates, welfare forms, and school reports, yet it was not a true family name. It was a shield, a chosen alias adopted by a network of related bloodlines stretching across 3 states. It disguised not just who they were, but who they had been to each other. Beneath that false name ran a chain of siblings who had become parents to their nieces, cousins who were also uncles, and children who could not explain who their fathers were because every answer led back to the same few faces. The first family tree drawn by caseworkers looked like a map of recursion, lines circling and folding back upon themselves, names repeating, mothers and daughters marked in the same ink. Officials struggled to make sense of it. Each time they tried to separate one household from another, the walls dissolved. This one's father was also her brother. That one's grandmother was her mother's sister. To understand the Colts was to enter a labyrinth built on silence. Tracing the roots meant returning decades, to the 1970s, when the first of the clan moved deep into rural New South Wales. They lived far from towns, surviving on benefits and barter, teaching their children that the outside world was dangerous, corrupt, and unnecessary. Those children grew, and within that closed world, new generations were born, each one taught that family was everything, and that family was all there was. Over time, the circle tightened. Outsiders stopped visiting. Letters went unanswered. Neighbors knew only that a cluster of shacks lay hidden in the valley and that the people who lived there kept to themselves. By the time authorities rediscovered them in 2012, for generations had passed under that single invented name. Medical records showed patterns that no doctor wanted to write plainly: congenital deformities, hearing loss, stunted growth, malformed teeth. But it was the psychological inheritance that haunted the investigators most. The children's concept of kinship had collapsed. When asked to name their father or mother, they used the same words for everyone: mom, uncle, nana. There were no boundaries left between them. Journalists, sifting through reports years later, would brand the Colt clan the most inbred family in modern history, yet within that headline was something quieter and sadder, a portrait of people who no longer remembered where family ended and self began. They had replaced lineage with a circle, turning inward until the name Colt no longer described a family at all, but a world entirely of their own making. Beyond the Blue Mountains, the land folds into itself, a scatter of ridges and gullies where the wind moves like water, and even the maps seem to hesitate. Here, roads fade into animal tracks, and the soil turns hard and red, thick with scrub that hides more than it reveals. The Colt settlement existed somewhere within that wilderness, tucked into a bowl of earth so remote that even locals spoke of it as rumor. From the air, it looked like nothing, a patch of gray-green brush, the faint trace of smoke mistaken for morning mist. On the ground, it was harder still to find. The path that led there wasn't marked on any chart. It curved through eucalyptus groves and dry creek beds, crossing fences that belonged to no one, until finally the sound of the outside world disappeared altogether. The geography was its first defense. Hills rose on all sides, steep enough to swallow sound, and rainwater gathered in narrow gullies that glistened but never flowed far. The settlement's placement was deliberate, a natural hollow that promised seclusion and escape. The nearest town lay miles away, its lights invisible past sundown. To reach it, one had to drive past the last mail route, then walk where even cattle refused to graze. That isolation wasn't accident, it was inheritance. The family had chosen it decades earlier for the very reason others avoided it. It offered invisibility. Locals who lived on the outskirts sometimes spoke of strange things that happened when the wind came from the west. Laughter, they said, echoing faintly across the valley floor at night, and the crackle of fires where no house should stand. A farmer remembered seeing smoke on mornings when the rest of the land lay still, rising in a perfect column before vanishing as if swallowed by the sky. Another swore that when he called out, no echo returned, as though the valley absorbed sound itself. They told these stories with a mix of curiosity and guilt, knowing now what had been hidden there all along. The land protected the Colts the way a cave protects its bats, darkly, without question. Its silence became their ally, its remoteness their disguise. Even satellites missed them. Tree canopy and mist blurred their outlines. For decades, they moved unseen, building shacks from scavenged tin and wood, their smoke blending with fog, their paths winding where no surveyor bothered to tread. When authorities finally stepped into that hollow, it was like entering a place unclaimed by the century, a pocket of time sealed off by geography itself. The valley had kept its secret faithfully, guarding the line between civilization and something older, quieter, and far less willing to be found. The story of the Colts does not begin in the valley where they were found, but decades earlier, when one man decided that the world had taken too much and offered nothing in return. His name, now buried under aliases and speculation, is remembered only as the patriarch, a drifter-turned-settler who moved his family from one forgotten town to another during the 1970s. Those who recalled him spoke of a man distrustful of institutions, bitter toward the government, wary of schools and churches alike. "We keep to ourselves," his eldest son once said, echoing what had been his father's only rule. That phrase would become the clan's creed, a sentence passed down like inheritance, until it grew into something no one dared question. He first settled on the edge of a small farming community, working odd jobs, repairing fences, and trading labor for supplies. But he avoided neighbors, declining invitations, keeping his children close and unregistered. When the local schoolteacher asked about enrollment, he moved again, this time deeper into the bush, where law and curiosity rarely traveled. Their isolation wasn't just preference, it was principle. He told his family that the outside world corrupted blood and weakened the soul, that to preserve themselves, they must stay pure, must keep the bloodline unbroken. It was a warning dressed as faith, and his children believed it. By the 1980s, that belief had hardened into custom. Cousins married cousins. Brothers took sisters as partners. The circle drew tighter with each generation. To outsiders, their absence barely registered. They weren't criminals or outlaws, just ghosts on the edge of census maps. The patriarch's descendants learned to live within that silence, building shelters from scrap, birthing children without doctors, teaching what little they knew of reading or prayer. But mostly, they passed down his single, relentless truth: the world beyond was poison. When investigators pieced together their origins years later, they found fragments of notes written on paper so brittle it fell apart in hand. A few sentences repeated in shaky handwriting: asterisk, we keep the name safe. We don't let the blood forget itself, asterisk. There were no dates, no full names, no mention of towns or schools. The journals read like scripture written by people who had forgotten who they were addressing. Those who studied the Colt lineage would later call it a system of inherited isolation, a social experiment without scientist or observer, where silence was law and love was confined within blood. Each generation became both keeper and prisoner of that legacy, repeating the patriarch's words until language itself narrowed to family names and whispers in the dark. What began as a man's mistrust of the world evolved into a structure of survival so absolute that it erased the very idea of outside. In the end, their silence wasn't just the absence of speech. It was belief made flesh, a bloodline bound by its own echo. When the authorities first brought the children out of the valley, daylight itself seemed to frighten them. They squinted at the sky as though it were too large, too bright, too loud. Some covered their ears when trucks started, trembling at the vibration of engines they had never heard before. They came barefoot, their soles calloused into tough leather from years walking over stones and dirt. Their clothes were mismatched, scraps of old shirts tied with wire or string. One child wore a t-shirt so faded the words were unreadable, another wrapped herself in a blanket patterned with holes. They carried nothing, not even toys or keepsakes, because there had never been anything to keep. Doctors and social workers soon realized these children had no conception of the world beyond their valley. When asked to name the capital of their country, they fell silent. One girl thought Canberra was a person. Another said she didn't believe in cities. A boy asked if school was a kind of animal. Their words came haltingly, stitched together from fragments of overheard conversation and invented phrases that made sense only to them. Their accent was strange, flat, uncertain, with long pauses as they searched for meaning. Some had never seen a book. Others had never spoken to anyone outside their bloodline. They were hungry, but not only for food. When volunteers offered bread, the younger ones ate it cautiously, tearing off pieces as though waiting for permission. The older ones watched every movement, alert and wary. Their eyes had the same expression, the gaze of children who had learned to read silence rather than faces. One nurse recalled that they seemed to listen with their whole bodies, flinching when someone whispered, as though sound itself might hurt. Examinations revealed signs of malnutrition: swollen joints, thin bones, teeth grown crooked from years without calcium. Some were underdeveloped, their growth stunted by neglect and genetics entwined. But what unsettled the doctors most was their composure. None of the children cried. None asked where they were being taken. When separated from one another, they reached out in panic, grasping at air until reunited. Their world had contained only family, and even that word was uncertain. They knew no strangers, no laws, no schools, no sky beyond the ridge. Journalists who later reviewed the case described them as children without an outside. They were born in a place without boundaries, raised without contrast, their entire sense of existence drawn from the faces and voices within that hidden circle. To them, the world beyond the valley wasn't forbidden, it simply didn't exist. And when they were finally pulled from it, blinking under the pale Australian sun, the first thing they learned was not what they had missed, but how vast the absence had been. Long before the helicopters came, before the photographs and the headlines, the valley's secret existed in fragments, stories exchanged across fences, murmured at pubs, half joking, half afraid. The people who lived along the outer ridges had always known something was off in that part of the bush. They spoke of smoke that rose from behind the trees at odd hours, never from a chimney, but from the ground itself, faint and bluish, drifting for minutes before vanishing. At dawn, drivers on the backroads claimed to see figures moving through the mist, barefoot, hunched, dressed in rags. Sometimes children, sometimes shapes too tall to be children, slipping back into the scrub before anyone could call out. A postman once told a story about hearing laughter where no house stood. He said it carried strangely, as though echoing from inside the earth. Others mentioned the sound of metal striking metal, the clatter of buckets or makeshift tools. One farmer swore he'd seen a girl digging through his compost heap at night, her hair tangled, her movements silent. When he shouted, she fled into the trees, barefoot, leaving only a trail of small prints in the mud. He reported it to the local police, who shrugged. Kids wandering, they said. Probably from one of the transient families that passed through. Nothing to worry about. Over the years, similar accounts appeared and disappeared like smoke. A woman found her washing line stripped of clothes. Another discovered the remains of a campfire near her paddock, surrounded by animal bones. A driver once stopped to help what he thought was a lost child, but when he got out, the figure was gone. No one pressed too hard. The valley was vast and lonely, and people learned that asking questions often meant being drawn into problems they didn't want to own. Some tried to report it formally, calls to welfare offices, notes to local councils, but the bureaucracy had its own kind of silence. Paperwork vanished. Reports marked inconclusive or no evidence found. The authorities visited once or twice, found nothing, and moved on. To most, the idea of an entire family hidden in plain sight seemed absurd, impossible. Modern Australia did not harbor secrets like that, or so they told themselves. Looking back, the locals admit it wasn't ignorance, it was avoidance. They had heard enough to sense what was there, but no one wanted to see it clearly. The bush swallowed things easily, and people learned to let it. The laughter, the smoke, the barefoot prints, they became part of the landscape's uneasy rhythm, a background hum of strangeness that everyone agreed to forget. When the truth finally surfaced, the valley wasn't the only one guilty of keeping silent. The people who had lived around it had done the same, and for decades, their silence had been the perfect camouflage. The story of how the world discovered the Colt family did not begin with police or journalists. It began with a child who appeared one morning at a bus stop on the edge of town. The teacher who found her remembered that day for the rest of her life. She had been waiting for her usual group of students when she noticed a small figure sitting apart from the others, barefoot, her legs drawn up to her chest. Her hair was matted, her clothes torn and filthy. At first, the teacher thought she was lost, a child from one of the rural properties who'd wandered too far. But when she asked her name, the girl only stared, blinking in slow confusion, as if the question itself was foreign. The girl spoke in fragments, her voice thin and uncertain. She said she had brothers, many of them, and that she lived over the hill, near the smoke. She couldn't say which road led home. When asked about her parents, she said she had lots of uncles, and her eyes flicked to the ground as if she had already said too much. What unsettled the teacher most wasn't just the dirt or the smell of neglect, it was the way the girl flinched from every sudden noise, like someone unaccustomed to the ordinary chaos of life beyond her valley. The teacher brought her inside, gave her water, and tried to reach the nearest welfare office. The child's hands trembled when she touched the phone, fascinated and terrified by its sound. It took hours for anyone to arrive, and when they did, the girl had already fallen asleep sitting upright, clutching the cup as though it were something sacred. She was taken for questioning, though there was little she could tell. Every answer led to more confusion. She couldn't read or write, couldn't recall an address, couldn't name her school, because there was no school. Her world, it seemed, ended where the trees began. When the teacher filed her report, the response from authorities was disbelief wrapped in politeness. The notes described the child as undersocialized, possibly from a transient or off-grid community. The idea of a family completely hidden from modern systems seemed too absurd to pursue. Caseworkers promised to review the situation and close the file within weeks. But the teacher couldn't forget the girl's eyes, pale, unblinking, filled with something between wonder and fear. She drove the same route for months afterward, glancing at that bus stop, half hoping and half dreading that another child might appear. None ever did. Yet that single morning, that lone figure stepping out of isolation had cracked the silence. It was the first ripple in a secret that had taken decades to reach the surface, and though the system tried to bury it again, the valley was already stirring. When the first DNA tests came back, the scientists could hardly believe the data. The charts that normally stretched outward like trees had collapsed into circles, each branch twisting back toward itself. Every new generation was not an expansion but a repetition. Siblings were parents, aunts were grandmothers, and children were born with no clear line between cousin and brother. The genealogists who studied the Colt family used words like closed loop and recurrent lineage, careful phrases meant to disguise what they truly meant. The bloodline had folded inward until it no longer remembered how to open. The results revealed what years of rumor had only hinted at. Fathers were also uncles. Mothers had given birth to children who were also their nieces. The same few sets of genes had intertwined for so long that individuality began to dissolve. One researcher, speaking off record, described it as genetic echoing. Every face looked faintly familiar. Every child carried the same pale eyes, the same narrow jaw, the same silence. Their bodies bore subtle, but unmistakable signs of strain: malformed teeth, skeletal irregularities, shortened limbs, hair that grew brittle under the sun. Yet what astonished the doctors was not the damage but the endurance. In isolation that should have collapsed generations ago, the Colt clan had survived. Medical teams recorded cognitive delays in most of the children, language patterns fragmented and confused. Many could not count beyond a few numbers or recall what day it was. Still, they displayed an uncanny awareness of each other. One child could finish another's sentence, another would mimic gestures with perfect timing. They moved through their environment with quiet coordination, as if governed by a rhythm no outsider could hear. It was not intelligence in the usual sense, but adaptation and evolution shaped by silence and sameness. When the genealogical diagram was presented to authorities, it no longer resembled a family tree at all. It looked more like a spiral, looping inward again and again, names overlapping until they became indecipherable. Some children had no official father listed, others had both parents recorded as siblings. To chart the Colts was to confront a mirror of isolation made flesh, each generation an echo of the one before. The scientists who handled the data admitted that the results felt less like a case study and more like a warning. Humanity, they said, depends on distance as much as connection. Remove the world, and a family becomes an ecosystem unto itself, self-sustaining, self-consuming, eternal only through repetition. The Colt family had endured beyond logic, a closed circle of blood where survival replaced progress, and love, stripped of boundaries, became indistinguishable from erasure. When the children were first taken from the valley and placed into care, the social workers realized something they hadn't been prepared for. The children could speak, but not to anyone outside their own circle. Words fell apart when directed at strangers. Sentences began in English, but drifted into sounds, clicks, hums, half-formed syllables that carried more rhythm than meaning. Yet when they turned toward each other, communication flowed like instinct. Their eyes flicked, hands moved, and murmured tones passed between them faster than translation could follow. It wasn't speech in the traditional sense. It was an inherited code, a language born from silence and necessity. Investigators who observed them described the exchanges as eerie in their precision. One child would grunt softly, and another would immediately rise or pass an object. A glance to the left meant caution. A tap on the leg meant stop. Sometimes they laughed together at moments no one else understood. When asked what was funny, they only stared blankly, unable or unwilling to explain. Linguists later analyzed recordings and found repeated patterns, truncated English words interwoven with invented sounds, grammar stripped down to its bones. It was, they concluded, a language of isolation, shaped not by textbooks or teachers, but by survival inside a world too small for outsiders. One officer described it perfectly when he said, "They spoke to each other like echoes. Words bounced between them until meaning emerged from repetition." It was as if they were finishing a thought none of them had started, but all somehow knew. Some experts compared it to the phenomenon known as cryptophagia, a secret speech shared by twins, but here, it had spread across generations, refined within the bloodline. In the absence of schooling, their ancestors had built a sound system of their own, passed from parent to child as both comfort and confinement. Teachers who tried to integrate them into classrooms found it nearly impossible. The children resisted the rhythm of ordinary language, the give and take of conversation. They preferred the cadence of their private speech, quick and circular. When reprimanded, they would murmur to each other under their breath, and though no one could translate it, the intent was clear: they were retreating to safety. One psychologist remarked that the language seemed less about words than about belonging. It was their last connection to the world they had lost, a structure that kept them bound to one another when everything else had been stripped away. The investigators could record it, document it, and catalog its sounds, but they could never truly understand it. For the children, that was the point. In a life where nothing was private, not their history, not their bodies, not even their blood, their hidden language was the final thing that remained untouched. The morning the state arrived, the mist was still low over the trees, and the air smelled of damp ash and rust. The convoy came in slow, four-wheel drives grinding over the dirt track that had never been meant for vehicles. When the child protection workers stepped out, they were met not with the sound of children playing, but with silence, an absence so deep that even the birds seemed to have fled. The first notes in the lead investigator's diary described that silence as unnatural, like walking into a memory that does not want to be disturbed. The shacks stood in uneven rows, patched together with tin, rope, and scavenged wood. Blankets hung where walls should have been. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of rot, smoke, and unwashed bodies. Pots of stagnant water sat beside fires that had long gone cold. There were no windows, no furniture, only piles of blankets on dirt floors and buckets used as toilets. A welfare officer wrote that stepping inside one of those shacks felt like entering a place where time had refused to move. Children watched from the shadows, their eyes wary but unafraid. They didn't cry or hide. They stood close together, touching shoulders, hands, arms, always in contact as if to remind themselves that they still belonged to one another. The older ones stepped forward first, blocking the smaller ones from view. When the workers tried to speak, the children only murmured to each other in that strange, private tongue, a series of clicks, whispers, and half-words that no one could decipher. A social worker opened her diary that night and wrote, "I've seen every kind of neglect. But this was like stepping backward in time. As though we'd found a pocket of the 19th century still breathing in the 21st. She described a family frozen by isolation, the outside world stripped away until only instinct and routine remained. The adults, when they appeared, spoke softly and smiled at the workers like nervous hosts greeting unwanted guests. They claimed everything was fine. The children were homeschooled, the shacks were temporary, but there were no books, no pens, no proof of schooling at all, only the marks of generations who had never known another life. When the officers radioed for supplies, food, blankets, medical aid, They did so with trembling hands. The valley, once quiet and forgotten, had opened its mouth at last, revealing what decades of neglect had grown in its soil. And as the sun began to fall behind the ridges, one officer turned to another and whispered, "It feels wrong to leave it here. But it feels worse to take it away, for in that settlement, surrounded by silence and decay, the state had finally found what it had been pretending not to see, a forgotten world still alive, still breathing, and still waiting to be believed." When the story of the Colt family broke, the public wanted a villain, someone to blame for what had festered in the valley for decades. But when the layers of investigation began to peel away, what emerged wasn't a single act of negligence, it was a chain of them, stretching back through years of reports, unanswered calls, and missing files. The system had been warned, more than once. Teachers, doctors, and neighbors had raised concerns that never reached the right hands, or, if they did, were stamped and filed into silence. The valley had been calling out for help long before the police arrived. No one had been listening. In the archives of New South Wales Social Services, investigators found case notes that read like whispers swallowed by paper. There were records marked "no contact" and "unable to locate residents," notes written in tidy cursive that carried the weight of indifference. A caseworker in 2001 had reported possible intergenerational neglect, but the file was closed within weeks. Another report from 2004 mentioned children of concern living in isolation, but it, too, was lost somewhere between departments. Some of the children born into the Colt clan had appeared briefly in government databases, registered for benefits or medical care, only to vanish again, untracked and unmissed. When journalists uncovered these failures, the ministries responsible reacted with a familiar choreography: statements of shock, promises of inquiry, words like unprecedented and tragic, yet behind the press releases, emails surfaced showing that local welfare officers had indeed visited the region. They'd driven as far as the road allowed, made a few calls, and left when no one answered. Protocol followed, boxes ticked, case closed. It was bureaucracy performing its most dangerous trick, mistaking procedure for action. The media seized on the story with a kind of hunger. Headlines shouted of Australia's incest clan, a nation's shame, generations lost to silence. But even as cameras swarmed the valley, officials remained cautious, their language sterile. They spoke of complex cases, of resource constraints, of unverified reports. None would say what the people already knew, that this was not discovery, but exposure. The system had not found the family. It had simply run out of ways to ignore them. One investigator put it bluntly in his notes, it wasn't just neglect. It was permission. The state had permitted the valley to remain unseen, its people to breed in secrecy, its children to grow without schooling or law. Not through malice, but through the quiet comfort of distance. To acknowledge them would have meant acknowledging failure. And so the files were closed, the warnings forgotten, and the cycle continued. In that way, the bureaucracy became a silent accomplice, one that didn't commit the horror, but allowed it to grow, one form stamped at a time. When the authorities finally separated the members of the Colt family and placed them into care or custody, the illusion of unity cracked. For decades they had spoken as one, voices folded together by routine, silence, and blood. But distance began to unspool the truth. The interviews that followed revealed a family not bound by belief alone, but by fear, by habit, and by the terrible gravity of isolation. What outsiders had imagined as a single, monolithic clan was in fact fractured, filled with quiet resentments and confused loyalties. Some of the older adults clung fiercely to the idea that their way of life had been chosen, not endured. They described the valley as freedom, a place where the state couldn't reach them, where family meant safety from judgment and shame. "We didn't harm nobody," one elderly man said, his voice calm, almost weary. "We just kept to our own." To him, and to others of his generation, the valley had been a refuge. They spoke of the outside world like a sickness that had never touched them. "The cities ruin people," one woman said. "We kept things pure." When pressed about the children born from those unions, her expression hardened. "We did what we knew. It's all we knew." But the younger voices, those who had grown up under that rule of silence, told a different story. Their testimonies were fragmented, words halting and uncertain. They spoke of nights when the forest outside the shacks felt safer than the rooms inside. Some whispered that they had never understood who was parent and who was uncle, who was safe to trust. They remembered hunger of food, of affection, of knowledge, and the constant hum of fear that seemed to settle over the family like a fog. One girl told investigators that she used to dream of roads, though she had never seen one. Another said she had once asked about school and been slapped for it. "Books aren't for us," her aunt had told her. "They change how you think." Those contradictions became the heart of the inquiry. To the elders, isolation had been protection. To the children, it had been captivity. The adults called it freedom because they had chosen it. The children called it survival because they had never been given a choice at all. The investigators who transcribed their words described the experience as haunting. The family spoke in layers, half-truths, denials, and flashes of confession, all colliding into something that felt like memory fraying at the edges. In the end, the Colts were not a single story, but a collection of them, tangled and at odds, each defending or damning the other. The adults clung to the myth of purity. The children bore the proof of what that myth had cost. Between them lay a silence that no report could fully break, a silence that had been mistaken for peace, but was only exhaustion, centuries old in its weariness. In the weeks after the raid, the children were taken from the valley and placed into temporary homes and clinics, each one under careful watch. The outside world, for them, arrived not as wonder but as confusion. Doctors and caseworkers later described the same expression appearing across their faces, a kind of quiet awe mingled with fear, as if every wall they had ever known had suddenly been replaced by air. One girl, no older than 10, spent hours staring out a window, her hands pressed to the glass. When asked what she was looking at, she whispered, "The lights don't stop." It took the nurse a moment to realize she meant the stars. She had never seen them before. Never seen beyond the canopy of her valley where the sky was always hidden by branches and smoke. Another boy, slightly older, sat in a classroom for the first time and asked his teacher, "What is school?" The question wasn't sarcastic. He had no frame of reference for what a school could be. When she explained that it was a place where children learned together, his brow furrowed. "Why?" he asked. "Don't they have their own?" For him, learning was a private thing, passed from mouth to mouth like a secret, not something shared in a room full of strangers. A teenage girl, taller and sharper-eyed than the others, refused to speak at all for days. When a psychologist finally coaxed her into conversation, she said she didn't like how quiet it was outside at night. "It's too open," she murmured. "The air listens." She slept with the curtains drawn tight, afraid that the sky might look back at her. Many of the children flinched at everyday sounds, the hum of refrigerators, the rush of water from a tap, the ring of a phone. Some mistook their reflections in mirrors for other people. One child cried because the floor was too smooth. Their language, too, began to unravel. Away from their siblings, the secret speech lost its rhythm. They tried to use English but stumbled, searching for words that had never existed in their old life. A boy held a book and asked if it was alive. A little girl stared at a light switch and laughed, calling it the small sun. The adults caring for them wrote that these moments were both miraculous and unbearable. Each discovery, running water, electric light, the sound of a train, was a tiny awakening, but behind it lingered grief. The children had stepped into the modern world, yet every new sensation carried the weight of what they had been denied. Their eyes, wide and unblinking, took in everything: the vastness, the noise, the impossible brightness of a world that had always existed just beyond their hills. And in that brightness, they began to see themselves for the first time, not as secrets, but as survivors. When the first news reports aired, the valley that had existed in secrecy for generations was suddenly flooded with light. Journalists poured in from Sydney, Melbourne, and beyond, their vans tracing the same dirt road that had once kept outsiders away. Helicopters hovered overhead, their blades scattering the mist that had hidden the settlement for decades. The silence of the hills was broken not by the hum of the Colt children's voices, but by the mechanical clicking of cameras. The world wanted to see what isolation looked like, what a family without the outside world had become. The nearby towns awoke to shame and fascination in equal measure. People who had lived their whole lives within a few hours' drive of the valley claimed ignorance. "We didn't know," they told reporters. "We thought they were just bush people, living quiet," yet some, when pressed, admitted they had seen the smoke, heard the laughter, even found barefoot tracks in the dirt. "They were our neighbors," one old man said, eyes fixed on the ground. "We just never wanted to know." His words hung in the air, a confession shared by many. Knowing meant responsibility, and responsibility meant guilt. It was easier, always, to pretend the valley wasn't there. Cafes filled with whispers. At the pub, men spoke of curses and sin, of that kind of thing, happening only in other countries. But the truth lay uncomfortably close to home. Some expressed pity, saying the Colts had needed help. Others expressed disgust, muttering about filth, about bloodlines, about bad stock, the language of compassion tangled with that of revulsion until no one could tell the difference. Churches held small vigils, though none of the family had ever attended a service. "We pray for the children," a preacher said softly, "and for the souls of those who raised them." The media turned the valley into spectacle. Each photo carried its own quiet cruelty: shacks collapsing under rust, toys carved from bones, a child's footprint pressed into mud. Every image reminded viewers that this wasn't a tale from the distant past, but from their own century. Reporters called it Australia's hidden family, a pocket of medieval life, a tragedy of the modern age. For locals, the words stung. Some stopped answering calls, unwilling to see their home turned into a symbol. Others leaned into it, offering interviews, tours, stories half true and half imagined. When the cameras left, the valley exhaled. The silence returned, though now it carried an echo, the murmur of voices that had never truly listened. The shacks remained, empty and sinking into the soil, reminders of what happens when a place becomes too good at keeping secrets. The valley had not spoken for decades, and when it finally did, no one liked what it had to say. In the months following the discovery, as the investigation slowed and the cameras retreated, the silence around the valley began to fill again, but this time, it was not with truth. It was with stories. People who had never set foot within 100 kilometers of the Colt settlement began to speak as though they had lived beside it. The myths bloomed quickly, spreading from pubs to classrooms, from internet forums to late-night radio. The family was no longer just a scandal of neglect. They were a legend, the kind born from disbelief and fear. Whispers told of rituals in the woods, of circles drawn in dirt at midnight, of fires that burned blue instead of red. Some claimed that the Colts worshipped an unseen figure they called the Old One, that they sacrificed animals, or worse, when the moon was high. Others swore that government agents had found graves on the property and covered them up to avoid panic. It didn't matter that the official reports contained no such findings. The more the state denied, the louder the stories grew. Soon, the children themselves became the focus of rumor. People said they had been born wrong, that their eyes reflected light like animals, that they could sense when someone was lying. A bus driver in a nearby town claimed he saw one of the rescued girls years later, standing at a crossroads at dusk, whispering to herself in a language that wasn't English. "I looked away for a second," he said, "and she was gone." The story spread before morning. Another rumor insisted that at night, if you walked too close to the valley, you could still hear them humming the same eerie, wordless songs they used to share in their shacks. Folklore does not need truth to survive. It only needs fear. And fear, once seated, grows fast. In small towns, people began to treat the Colt Valley as cursed ground. Children dared each other to climb its fences. Hikers avoided the ridge after dark. Farmers claimed their cattle wouldn't graze there anymore. Even the wind seemed to carry its own warning, the rustle of leaves mistaken for whispers. Scholars compared the spread of these myths to earlier rural legends, echoes of the American South's blind clans and Appalachian ghost stories. Isolation breeds imagination as easily as it breeds secrecy. The Colt family had become something larger than themselves, their suffering twisted into cautionary tales. The line between fact and folklore blurred until no one could tell which version they were repeating. Perhaps, in the end, that was inevitable. The truth had always lived in silence, and once silence was broken, the void demanded to be filled. When the case reached the universities, the tone shifted from outrage to inquiry. Scientists came quietly, not with cameras but with clipboards, blood kits, and notebooks filled with questions they weren't sure they wanted answered. Geneticists, anthropologists, and sociologists all gathered around the fragments of a family that had outlived its own time. The Colts, for the researchers, were not monsters or outlaws. They were a living study of what happens when a bloodline closes itself off from the world. What they found was not evil, not madness, but entropy, the slow, natural collapse of humanity turned inward until nothing new could grow. Samples were collected, charts drawn, and data compiled. The genetic maps showed what the stories had already hinted at: repetition. The same patterns of inheritance looping endlessly, mutations rising not from chance, but from inevitability. One researcher described it as a human system without external input, a kind of social and biological echo chamber. The effects were visible not only in their DNA but in their behavior. The family's language, their gestures, their superstitions, all mirrored each other until individuality was almost impossible to detect. Even when separated, they moved with similar hesitations, the same glance downward when confronted, the same wary silence before answering a question. Sociologists compared their isolation to that of lost tribes or shipwrecked communities that reinvented order from fragments of memory. But the Colts had no mythology of origin, no elder preserving a history. Their laws were survival and routine. Their rituals were chores. The patriarchs had long since blurred into anonymity. What you see, one sociologist wrote, is not a culture, but the residue of one. It is what remains when tradition continues without meaning. In laboratory language, the results were clinical, detached. Yet even scientists could not escape the unease. The data suggested that what had happened to the Colts was not an aberration, but a mirror, a reflection of how fragile social systems can become when left unchecked. Remove education, remove contact, remove the friction of other minds, and even the most complex creature folds back into instinct. The researchers debated ethics, how much to publish, how to protect identities, how to balance curiosity against compassion. Some called the family a tragedy of biology, others a warning of sociology. When they left the valley, carrying vials and field notes, most did so in silence. The answers they sought had come, but not with satisfaction. They had peered into a place where evolution had reversed itself, where progress had collapsed into repetition, and what stared back at them was not monstrosity, it was humanity stripped bare, still surviving, but only just. When the first internal documents began to leak, the public learned that the valley's silence had not been complete. There had been voices, faint, bureaucratic, and quickly buried. Reports dating back nearly 2 decades surfaced from forgotten archives, stamped with the careful language of evasion. Situation resolved, no further action required, insufficient evidence. Each line represented a moment when the truth had brushed against the system, only to be filed away and forgotten. The revelations came not from whistleblowers or reformers, but from a stack of misfiled papers discovered during an audit. The government had known in fragments for years. The earliest warnings came from welfare officers who noted possible intergenerational neglect and unusual isolation. They were told to prioritize urban cases, families easier to reach, easier to fix. Rural reports carried less urgency. There were notes from police who attempted to investigate but were discouraged by superiors citing jurisdictional confusion. Medical clinics had filed forms about unvaccinated children and mothers without identification. Each complaint existed, but none were connected. The state had seen the pieces, but never allowed itself to recognize the whole. When journalists pressed for explanations, the responses were almost rehearsed. The system failed, procedures have since improved, we are reviewing historical shortcomings, yet behind those public statements, Officials spoke off record with something that sounded closer to shame than denial. One retired welfare director admitted that the case had lingered in their department for years, passed between offices like an unwanted burden. "It wasn't that we didn't care," he said softly. "It was that we couldn't believe it." Things like that don't happen here until they do. Another official confessed that isolation made the story inconvenient. It didn't fit the image of a modern nation. Poverty, crime, drugs, those could be explained. But an entire family vanishing into the bush, marrying only their own, birthing children who'd never seen a school or a doctor. That felt medieval, a stain too ancient for a digital age. Politicians avoided the topic. Parliamentary questions were deflected with words like sensitive, ongoing, or under review. Public servants were told to keep comments internal. Silence became the state's last defense, the same weapon it had unknowingly shared with the Colt family for generations. Both had relied on secrecy, the family to survive, the government to save face. The documents now sit in archives, their language precise, their meaning damning. They show not a lack of knowledge, but a lack of imagination, the inability to believe that beneath paved roads and satellites, a world so primitive could still exist. The government's silence was not absence. It was disbelief made policy, and it lasted just long enough for the valley to raise 4 generations unseen. When the journalists returned to the valley years later, the road that once led to the Colt family's hidden world was nearly gone. Grass and scrub had swallowed the path, and the old tire tracks were no more than shallow scars in the dirt. The valley itself seemed reluctant to be found, as though it had tried to heal the wound of its own exposure. The air was different now, still heavy, still quiet, but no longer secret. The land had gone back to pretending nothing had ever happened. The shacks remained, though barely. Rusted tin sheets leaned like broken teeth against the skeletons of wooden frames. Weeds had forced their way through the floorboards, curling up through cracks and swallowing what little furniture had survived. Where a child's cot once stood, a sapling had rooted itself, pale leaves trembling in the wind. A cooking pot, blackened by years of fire, lay half buried in the mud. There were shoes too small, frayed, missing laces, scattered like memories across the ground. The crew moved carefully, speaking in whispers as if the family might still be listening. "You can feel it," the cameraman murmured. Like the land remembers them, when the wind passed through the rusted metal, it made a low, hollow sound, almost a voice, almost a breath. One reporter later described it as the closest thing to an echo she had ever heard without anyone speaking. Inside one of the remaining huts, a wall was still covered in marks, lines, scratches, faint initials carved by uncertain hands. Some believed they were children's drawings, others thought they were attempts to count days or record family ties. Whatever they meant, time had worn them to near nothing. The valley was erasing its own record, grain by grain. Nature had reclaimed what the world had abandoned. Birds nested in rafters. Goats, perhaps descendants of the ones once kept by the family, wandered freely through the grass. In the distance, a thin stream cut through the hollow where the main camp had been, glinting under sunlight that no Colt child had ever seen. The journalists filmed everything, but no amount of footage could capture the unease. The silence was still alive, shaped by decades of human breath and secrecy. When they left at sunset, the crew looked back one last time. The valley seemed almost peaceful, but something lingered, an invisible weight, as if the air carried what the people had left behind. Not just poverty, not just tragedy, but memory itself. A place where human history had folded inward until it vanished, leaving behind only the whisper of what once lived there. The years that followed scattered the Colt children across Australia like seeds cast into unfamiliar soil. New homes, new towns, new names. Some were adopted quietly, others placed into long-term care under strict confidentiality. For a time, they vanished from public record, absorbed into a system that tried to forget where they came from. But time doesn't erase memory. It only teaches silence a different shape. When the first of them began to speak as adults, their words carried the weight of a world that had existed apart from everyone else's. Those who found their voices did so carefully. A few gave interviews under pseudonyms, their faces blurred, their accents faintly rural but touched by the edges of schooling. They spoke not of horror, but of confusion, of learning the difference between danger and normalcy. They told me I could sleep with the door closed, one woman said. It took me months to believe that meant I was safe, another recalled the first time she heard a refrigerator hum through the night. I thought something was alive in the walls. I couldn't sleep. Dreams still tied them to the valley. Each spoke, in one way or another, of sound of low vibrations, humming in the dark, sometimes so faint they couldn't tell if it came from memory or from somewhere else. One man, who had been a child of 10 when rescued, said quietly, "We still hear the hum at night. I don't know if it's real. Maybe it's just what silence sounds like to us." Others mentioned dreams of trees bending inward, of eyes in the dark that didn't belong to anyone, of walking without stumbling through places they'd never seen. Their therapists called it trauma, the brain's way of replaying confinement. But the children, now adults, described it differently. "It's not fear," one said. "It's home. The sound of where we were." Some adapted well: jobs, families, small lives built far from headlines. Others struggled, lost in the spaces between two worlds, one that had hidden them and one that didn't know what to do with them once they were found. A few vanished into anonymity, changing names again, perhaps seeking the quiet that had once defined their childhood. For the rest, the valley lingers as a place half-remembered, half-imagined, a dream of dirt floors and voices speaking in echoes. They carry it in gestures, in silence, in the way they flinch at sudden noise. Time has carried them forward, but part of them remains rooted in that forgotten hollow, where the hum never really stopped. It became part of their blood, the rhythm of survival, the song of a family that once lived unseen. The screen fades to dusk, and the sound that fills it isn't music but wind. The camera moves slowly, gliding above the valley that once hid the Colt family. There are no people here now, no children's laughter, no murmured voices under the tin roofs. Only the long sigh of the earth reclaiming what was taken from it. The shacks lie in ruin, half buried in the grass. Walls that once held warmth and secrecy have collapsed, the last fragments of wood curling in the rain. It feels less like decay and more like surrender. The narrator's voice comes softly, almost reverent, as though afraid to disturb what remains. How could this happen in the modern world? The question drifts into the air unanswered, carried by the wind that threads through the rusted metal. It is a question that belongs not to the past, but to the present, to every silence that hides behind the illusion of progress. The documentary does not offer solutions, only reflections. Poverty, ignorance, shame, these are the simple words we give to what we cannot face. But beneath them lies something older, something buried in the human instinct to fold inward, to retreat from judgment, to build walls out of fear and call them home. As the camera drifts lower, we see the valley as it is now, a hollow of grass and shadow. Sunlight catches on a piece of corrugated tin, flashing briefly like a mirror, then dulling again. The soil is dark, rich from decades of ash and decay. Birds move through the air in slow arcs, unbothered, as if the land's secret never touched them. For a moment, the frame holds on the empty space where the main cabin once stood. There is no movement, but the silence feels inhabited, thick with memory. The narrator continues, "Some stories don't end. They just stop being found." The voice trembles slightly on the word found, the way one might speak of something unearthed rather than told. The shot widens, the valley shrinking into distance, the hills curling around it like a closing hand. The sound fades until only the wind remains, carrying with it a faint hum that could be memory or could be nothing at all. The final image lingers, sunlight fading over rust and grass, the earth reclaiming the shape of its own wound. What the land keeps is not guilt or horror, but silence, the kind that waits patiently, knowing that one day, someone will listen again. Then the screen darkens and the hum stops, leaving the audience with nothing but the echo of their own breath.